Hey guys, it's Leah. Welcome back, or welcome if you are new, and welcome to my January wrap up from worst to best. For the entirety of 2024, and I even think at some point during 2023, I always started doing my wrap ups from worst to best. I don't know why, I feel like it is so fun to do it that way. We definitely had some average books, but we also had books that I was utterly obsessed with and ones that I feel like I'm never going to stop recommending. So I'm really excited to talk to you about all of the books that I started 2025 with. So in January, I ended up reading 12 books, which I was so incredibly happy with. 7 of them were on my physical TBR, 5 weren't. Read quite a few proofs in January of books that have yet to been published, so obviously I don't have them on my TBR yet. I read them on my Kindle. Every single month I'm always aiming for over half of the books that I read to be ones on my physical TBR, and I already accomplished that, so I was really happy with that. To kick off all of the books that I did read in January, we'll start with a book that I actually DNF'd. I did DNF one book in the month, and this one was actually incredibly sad because it was my first book club book of the year. I'm really hoping that the rest of the year we're not going to have any DNFs and it's just going to be 5 stars and such incredible reads. The one that I did DNF was The City and Its Uncertain Walls by Murakami. Initially, this was a 2024 release that I was so incredibly excited about after reading a few of Murakami's novels already. My favourite from him absolutely being After Dark. That is a 5-star read for me, and I was so excited because every single thing out of his backlist, he has published so many books now. Out of all of them, The City and Its Uncertain Walls was definitely the one that I had most interest in, and yeah, no. I feel like there's so much discussion surrounding Murakami and his works, and especially his narratives and the way that he writes women. However, in all of the novels that I'd read from him before, I never really saw a problem personally with the way that he narrated women, but in this one, oh my god, I completely see what people were talking about. It felt like not 10 pages could go by without him mentioning her boobs, and it just drove me utterly insane. I don't know if I ever will try to revisit this, slash when I will even get to another Murakami. I feel like I need to have a break from him for a little while. Oh my god, I just also realised I'm not wearing my rings. I'm gonna put those on. I don't know about anyone else, but whenever I'm not wearing my rings, I literally don't feel like myself. So we've put them on. That was my DNF of the month. And then going on to the worst book that I read in January. This one does feel slightly harsh because it was clear that it just wasn't, unfortunately, a poetry collection for me, but it was Not Waving But Drowning by Stevie Smith. I had never read any poetry by Stevie Smith before, but this one was very kindly sent to me by the publisher, and I was really hoping I was going to love it because it's a gorgeous book. I did read it physically. It was on my physical TBR. I have since decided to unhaul it just because I ended up rating it 2 stars. I feel like it just wasn't necessarily for me. Poetry is obviously so incredibly subjective, so I do feel quite bad about saying this was the worst book that I read, but it was the lowest one that I had rated in the month. The illustrations in this were absolutely gorgeous, however, it was just in terms of the poetry, it wasn't necessarily for me, so I rated that one 2 stars. And then I read my first proof for a book coming out in 2025, and that was The River Has Roots by Amal El-Mota. Initially was so excited about this because How to Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mota, but also Max Gladstone, was one of my favourite books of 2024. It was a book that I felt utterly in love with, mainly also because of the writing style, so I was so excited to go into another Amal El-Mota book, but also intrigued to see how it would work on their own. I did absolutely love the writing in this, especially considering it was such a short book. It definitely packed a punch, and the imagery was so vivid and so beautiful. I do, looking back on it now, remember there was one specific scene that I read and I was completely floored by it. I love anything that is sentient, especially if sort of instrument is sentient. I feel like that is so niche. I don't know, I feel like there are certain things in literature and in books that I love so much that nobody ever really talks about, and one of them absolutely is something that's sentient that shouldn't be, especially an instrument, and this sort of had that vibe. I would actually recommend this to anybody who is looking for a short whimsical fantasy read that is really eloquent and really beautiful. I think it did that perfectly. I just wish it was so much longer. I feel like it was sort of condensed down so much that I couldn't really resonate with any of the characters nor form an attachment. That was probably my biggest criticism of the book. In terms of the imagery, it was beautiful. In terms of the writing, it was beautiful. I was just hoping for a lot more. I ended up rating it 3.25 stars, but like I said, I would recommend it if you're into that sort of read. Then we have Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica O. One thing about me, we know I love a Fitzcarraldo edition. I am planning on reading, honestly, as many Fitzcarraldo editions as I can, period, in my life, but especially this year. And this was actually my first read of 2025. I do love kicking off a new year with like a 5-star prediction or a book that I feel like I'm absolutely going to adore, solely because this is a Fitzcarraldo edition and I hold them to such high standard. I feel like I adore so many of them and a lot of them become my favourites. I wanted to kick off the year with one, and this was the one that people chose also on my Instagram story. So I started off the year with this, and I will say it didn't quite live up to the expectation that I had. This is a really quiet novel following a mother and daughter in Tokyo. We are travelling abroad and we are sort of following their inner monologue. When I do say it is quiet, I mean it is quiet. Like nothing happens in this. It is pure vibes. And I do love a vibe over plot sort of read, especially if it's literary, and this one was really good for that. The writing was also astonishing. But I feel like that when I first read the blurb, I got an entirely different perception of this than what it really was. Like for example, it says they walk along the canals through the autumn evenings, escape the typhoon rain, share meals in small cafes and restaurants, and visit galleries to see some of the city's most radical modern art. All the while they talk about the weather, horoscopes, clothes and objects, and about family, distance and memories, but uncertainties abound. Who is really speaking here? Is it only the daughter? I was completely expecting this to be a lot more surreal and a lot more philosophical. I love surrealist literature. I love not knowing what is entirely happening in a plot, and on the blurb it definitely swayed towards that, and don't get me wrong, there definitely were elements of that in this, but nowhere near as much as I had hoped, so for that it naturally did let me down slightly. Of course that is down to my own expectation, and I did really enjoy a lot of this, like I just said, but it wasn't really groundbreaking for me, so I ended up rating it 3.5 stars. Then we had a book that I read more towards the end of the month, and this one actually breaks my heart to have it at this point in the ranking. I read this in my most recent vlog where I was reading some of the most anticipated 2025 releases, so if you want to know like my deep delved thoughts, definitely go into that. But the next book is definitely We Do Not Part by Han Kang. This was absolutely a 5-star prediction for me this year. I was expecting to fall in love with it. Han Kang is definitely one of my favourite authors. She also won the Nobel Prize in Literature last year, and I swear to God, I've never known happiness like I did in that moment when I found out she had won. She is such an incredible and unique and eloquent novelist, and I've read every single novel that has been translated into English by her yet, and this one, like I said, I was expecting to absolutely adore. In many ways I did adore this, in many ways I also didn't adore this. One thing that I cannot fault Han Kang for is the way that she intertwines real moments of history and real historic periods into fiction in such an eloquent and careful and really considerate way. And this was absolutely no different in this. We are following a lot of South Korean history and a massacre that had occurred in South Korea. It made the story incredibly tender and incredibly raw, and I think that Han Kang does topics like that brilliantly. This unfortunately is definitely my least favourite that I've read from her yet, which actually makes me so incredibly sad. I was highly anticipating this to be like my first 5-star of the year, and I'm not gonna lie, I ended up rating it 3.5 stars. I think one of the things that let me down most with this is the narrative. I love narratives that are written in like a diary entry format or something that is incredibly heavy within a dialogue or stream of consciousness, and this definitely dipped its toe into that, but for some reason, I think it was mainly the pacing. It felt so incredibly slow, and I actually read this so incredibly quickly, but the pacing just really was so off for me. I feel like it could have been a lot shorter and the pacing would have been a lot better, but I mean, I'm not an editor, so I can't really comment on that completely. The pacing for me just felt slightly off. I do absolutely still adore Han Kang. I would still recommend any of her works. Like I said, this is definitely my least favourite from her, unfortunately, but I'm still so happy that I had read it. Yeah, I think in that vlog I said that I ended up rating it 3 stars, but I have since bumped it up to a 3.5. Then we have another book that I read in a vlog, so you can see all of my in-depth thoughts over there, but this one I actually didn't end up rating. When I was going through all the 12 books that I read in January, this one felt the most right here, but that is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This is a classic that I'd put off for years. I've always wanted to read it. I've actually read quite a lot of Sylvia Plath's poetry, but I don't know why with this, it was just intimidating me slightly. And I finally read it for my video where I was reading your guys' favourite books of 2024, and I can completely see why so many people love it and why it is such a beloved classic. It definitely has its faults. It's definitely a classic that you need to read in terms of its context, but it is a very fascinating read. I think even in terms of just the bell jar quote, this changed so many people's lives and changed literature as a whole. I think Sylvia Plath's backstory and her life was so tragic. Knowing some of the context, not only in terms of when this was published, but her life in general, it makes the story even more tragic and even more heartbreaking. But yeah, I'm really happy that I finally read it. But like I said, I didn't end up rating it, and I still wouldn't know what to rate it even if I were to rate it now, but it felt right in this sort of point of the list. Then we have a book that I read on my Kindle, and that is Ice by Anna Kavan. This book was so interesting. I definitely feel like I read it at the wrong time. I love so much. We already touched upon the fact that I love surrealist literature, but I also love dystopian literature, and I love literature that is a social commentary on things like climate change and how that all kind of interweaves and intertwines together. And this is a book perfect for that. It is a novella. It's under 200 pages, and it was published in 1967. The whole time that I was reading this, I was having this real moment of, I find dystopian literature that leans more climate change-esque so fascinating, but also reading it from a modern lens in 2025, and this was written in the 60s, and the similarities are devastating. It is so surreal to read a book that was published that long ago, but it has even more relevancy kind of now in 2025, while we are seeing some things that happened in this fictionalized novel in real life. It actually blows my mind, and it's one of the reasons that I love social commentary in literature so much. In terms of the plot, it definitely lost me slightly, and the characters I found slightly confusing, but the atmosphere definitely carried it for me, and I ended up rating that one 3.75 stars. Next we have another one that I read physically. This was one that I read at the very start of the month, and another one that I actually didn't rate again because I wouldn't really know how to rate it. This book specifically, the main reason I didn't want to rate it is because it's both a book that is quite fictional but also very autobiographical. Definitely want to preface before even showing or talking about the book, this was such a heavy read. It deals a lot with the author author's suicide, and if you don't want to read anything like that, do not pick up this book. I think she really does not hold back on all of her thoughts, and definitely in the autobiographical accounts it's very blurred between what is fiction and what was very autobiographical, but it's very, very heavy and very raw. Also, her writing was so incredibly beautiful. It was Last Words from Montmartre, and I can never pronounce this author's name, so I'm gonna show you. I'd been wanting to read something from this author for years. She wrote Notes of a Crocodile, which I still have yet to read. That is her fiction novel. So I decided to start this one. It was also my first buddy read of the year with my best friend, and it was a beautiful, beautiful experience. The writing in this was actually jaw-dropping. Like, I underlined so many of the quotes that I just fell utterly in love with. It's also simultaneously sort of written in letters. You can read the letters out of order. It's in chronological order, but also not. It is just such a unique book, and I was drawn to it for so many different reasons, but it was such a heavy read, and I don't think that it is one that I'm gonna reread, nor will I reread it anytime soon. I definitely need to be in the right headspace. Somebody on the blurb described it perfectly, so I'm gonna read that out. Last Words from Montmartre is urgent, ecstatic, unbridled, and breathtakingly intimate. She is a writer who truly defies categorization, and this book, her last, part confession, part love letter, part fiction, part memoir, part suicide notes, is a thrilling testament to her original mind and impassioned heart. It was utterly heartbreaking, and a book that is so incredibly unique, but one that I definitely would not recommend, nor would I recommend it lightly. Definitely check up the trigger warnings. It is a heavy read, but definitely a beautiful one, so I didn't want to rate it for that. Then though, we go on to all of the books that I rated 4 stars and higher. First and foremost, this one broke my heart. It was And Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer by Fredrik Backman. This was actually my second Fredrik Backman that I read in January, the first being the next book that I actually will talk about, but this one actually tore me apart. I had always heard people talking about this book. I mean, it's literally like, what, 80 pages, if that. It is tiny. I had always heard people talking about how heartbreaking it was, how everybody cries and everybody loves it, and oh my god, people were not lying. It was such a heartbreaking read, essentially following a grandson and his granddad as he's kind of losing pieces of his memory and he's sort of deteriorating. The way it spoke about grief and premeditated grief and what you do when you are kind of trying to accept that you're losing somebody, it was heartbreaking. I think the way that Fredrik Backman writes, as I learned in January for the first time, is so beautiful and so unique, and he really captures emotions so perfectly. Considering it is such a short read, the way that he packs such a punch was actually breathtaking. I would recommend this, but actually expect to cry. It was so sad. And then obviously we have another Fredrik Backman. This was the first one that I ever read from him, and that is Bear Town. This was another one that I read in the Reading Your Guys' Favourite Book of 2024 vlog, and oh my god, I had seen this book everywhere last year. As a matter of fact, I've seen it everywhere for the past few years. I've seen Fredrik Backman everywhere for the past few years, but especially last year, I feel like this one definitely had a resurgence, and I'm so happy that I finally read it, because I'm not gonna lie, I was never sure if I was actually ever gonna get to any of his books, because I knew I probably would like them, but it's just one of those authors. I think especially from when I was a bookseller, I would see his work all of the time, and I just never got that instant pull to read it, so I kind of just shelved it in the back of my mind. Why do I want to binge read every single thing he's ever written now? This was astonishing and is absolutely so worth the hype. Bear Town is a tiny, tiny town set at the edge of a forest. It is constantly snowy, but this town is kind of off of the map. There are no longer really any job opportunities. It's quite an isolated, abandoned town. And one thing that I love in literature so much, especially in reads like this, are depictions and descriptions on what it is like to live in a tiny town and a tiny village where everybody knows everyone, everybody knows each other's secrets. There is drama. I love it so much, and Fredrik Backman just did that perfectly. One thing that I loved so much about this is that we have such an ensemble cast. We don't really have like one main character, and I love that because we're following so many different people, and we are following their family lives and their friendships and all of their complications, and it was just such a beautiful read, and you do feel so attached to these characters. This definitely at some point does start getting into a very heavier terrain. It talks a lot about sexual assault. That is definitely a big trigger warning in this book, but I do think the way that Fredrik Backman wrote it was handled with so much care and so much consideration, and the story was just so beautiful but so heartbreaking. I am utterly terrified to carry on with the series. I don't know when I'm going to carry on, because I do want to get them all physically. I want to read them all physically, and I am on a book buying ban until April. I do want to make sure that I finish and read the entirety of the series this year, because I feel like I'm going to absolutely love it. It's a series that I'm always going to think about. I cannot get these characters out of my brain even now. I absolutely adored it. I ended up rating it 4.5 stars. It was very close to a 5 stars. I don't know what it was. Something just felt slightly missing for me in terms of that, but I loved it so much. So I would highly recommend, but definitely check trigger warnings. Another 2025 proof that I read, which I also read in that vlog, so definitely check that out if you want all my thoughts, was Say You'll Remember Me by Abby Jimenez. I still cannot believe that I got to read this so early. I literally, when I tell you this is one of her best books, like literally one of her best books. It is also simultaneously, I would say, her most emotional read yet. She does not hold back on the emotion, and that is something that I think Abby Jimenez does so well. A lot of my favourite romance books are ones that balance the romance and the tension and the banter and all of that fun, light-hearted stuff with the more serious, like, family dynamics or grief or anything like that. I think when you can strike that perfect balance in a romance book, you're setting yourself up for such a good story, and Abby Jimenez does that all the time perfectly. This one I just absolutely adored. We are following Yvette. There is like a VILF, which is basically a DILF, but Yvette. The escape room scene I think about all of the time, probably the best scene that Abby Jimenez has ever written ever. I really think that you should go into this one knowing as little as possible. But like, obviously most people are going to pick it up just because they already love Abby Jimenez. That's definitely the best way to do it. This is definitely up there with one of my favourites from her. I loved it so much. This was another one that was very closely teetering to that 5-star edge. I think I ended up rating it 4.5 stars. It'd be 4.5, 4.75. I absolutely adored it. I honestly think that I might reread it when it's actually published, just so when everyone's talking about it I can relive it again. I just loved it so much. So definitely worth the hype, or what's going to become the hype. Okay, we're on to the top 2 books that I read in January. Next we have a proof that I am going to hold up for a couple of seconds, then I'm just going to put the cover on screen because this is going to blind both you and I. But it is Quicksilver by Callie Hart. This is the gorgeous, like, luminous proof. So I'm now going to put that on screen so we're not blinded. Another book that I read in the Reading Your Guys' Favourite Book of 2024 video, and thank you guys so much. I knew it was such a popular romantasy last year and I wasn't entirely sure if I was going to understand the hype, if I was going to like it. The hyperfixation was real. You will see in that vlog, if you've already watched it yet. If you haven't, I would recommend watching it because I'm there giggling, kicking my feet, literally screaming over this book. I cannot stop thinking about it. The book Hangover that overtook me when I had finished it, I was obsessed with it. If you are looking for a really fun, good romantasy series, or I suppose right now it's only the first book out, I am so excited for the second book coming out later this year. When I tell you I am going to get my hands on it the second it's published, and I'm going to read it the second it is published. I just think that the world building was so well done, and it was also so incredibly unique in terms of the magic system. I loved that the magic system was based on silver. I loved the fae element. I loved the sort of vampire element. It was just such a perfect fantasy book, and I know that I'm going to become utterly obsessed with the series, especially due to the way that this one finished. I need the second book in my hands like right now. I actually would do anything for a proof. I actually just had the time on my life with it. I would highly recommend it if you are looking for a good romantasy series. Like the love interest too, the tension, I'm actually obsessed with them. This is definitely up there as one of my new current favourite romantasy books, and I cannot wait to carry on with the series. And then my favourite book of January, and also my first 5-star book of the year, was another fantasy. Was another romantasy. When I tell you I am in my fantasy era, all I have read in February so far is fantasy books, and I'm actually not complaining. It was The Rebel Witch by Kristen Cicerelli. I absolutely adored The Crimson Moth last year. I think I ended up rating it 4.5 stars, so I was incredibly excited for the sequel. I had really high expectations, but I feel like when it comes to sequels, for some reason with me, they very rarely live up to their first part, but this one, even better than The Crimson Moth, babe. Like, actually, it was another one that I read in my most recent vlog. I would highly recommend watching that if you haven't already, because I literally sobbed over the ending of this book. You will see me crying. It was so good. The way that The Crimson Moth left off for this one was so perfect. I feel like the tension in this book was just as good as the first one. Definitely learned about myself in fantasy that a trope that I adore is the witch ex-witch hunter trope, and this one just did it so perfectly. This now is actually probably my favourite fantasy duology. Yeah, that's crazy, but it probably is my favourite fantasy duology. In terms of the romance element, both in The Crimson Moth and also The Rebel Witch, the stakes and the tension and the chemistry, you can cut it with a knife. Naturally, with some fantasy books or romantasy books, or even just romance books in general, I do have to kind of force myself to seize the chemistry between the two main characters, but not with this one at all. Genuinely think that they are some of my favourite couples that I have ever read from ever. I was utterly in love with them, and so many scenes in this, there were so many tropes, so many quotes. When I tell you, some of the quotes in this actually made me sob my eyes out. It just absolutely floored me. I fell utterly in love with it. I am so excited to talk about it with everyone when it comes out. I'm so happy that it comes out this month. I'm so confident that this is my first 5-star of the year. I'm so happy that it was a 5-star, and definitely, like I said, a new favourite fantasy book and a new favourite fantasy series. I already want to go back and reread The Crimson Moth and reread The Rebel Witch. I am definitely going to get both of them physically in hardback. I need physical, like, manifestations of them to hold, because some of my favourite books now. I'm literally obsessed with them. But yeah, those are the 12 12 books that I read in January. If you've read any of the books that I also read, let me know whether you like them, whether you dislike them. If any of them are on your TBR, if any of them you're excited to read at some point, definitely let me know. I would love to talk about any of these in the comments. Simultaneously, definitely feel free to let me know what your favourite book of January was or what your least favourite book of January was. If you did watch until the very end of the video and you don't know what to comment any purple emoji for the Rebel Witch. As always, all of my socials are linked down in the description box below. We have my Patreon where I have a monthly and bi-monthly classics book club. We have a besties group chat on Discord. You can get exclusive videos from me over there. We do live streams, live reading sprints, monthly giveaways. There is always a lot of fun happening over there. But I do also have my Instagram and my TikTok and also my Goodreads where you can find reviews for every single book that I read. But yeah guys, thank you so much for being here as always and for watching. I really hope you enjoyed and I will see you again very, very soon with another video.